Welcome, and we are here at the studios of CCTV, Town Meeting Television. I'm Mark Johnson. I'll be your host this afternoon for our discussion with Jym Wilson, who I worked with at the Burlington Free Press. He went on to bigger and better things, worked at Gannett and USA Today, and is actually back here in Burlington as part of the launch of the new book about Bernie Sanders, Bernie for Burlington. Jym, welcome. This is your life.
It feels that way. It really does.
The first thing I wanted to ask you about, you went to South Burlington High School, you're a local. How did you get into photography?
My freshman year, I was a volunteer in the AV department, which meant that I was one of those guys that would, roll the projector down the hall to the classroom. But I was also already interested in photography. And the teacher who ran the AV department made sure I, was starting to learn some stuff. I was also very into the news. And there was a class that was specifically for seniors called PWA, Public Issues in World Affairs, which I learned just the other day is still in existence 50 years later,
Wow.
Which just stuns me. Anyway, it was a one-semester class for every senior, and I started sort of auditing it. Whenever I could make my schedule work, I would sit in on this class. And that's how I ended up, for one thing, hearing Bernie speak for the first time, which was sort of part of the whole, gee, I made a photo of this guy, gee, he's interesting, and it sort of tumbled from there. So by the time I graduated, I knew that at least photography and probably journalism was going to be a career path.
Well, and clearly you knew that he'd run for president twice.
I absolutely knew that.
Yeah.
50 years prior, 52 years prior. So,
how'd you get the job at the Free Press?
I had made it a point of, I was working at a department store called Gaines, which a lot of folks probably remember, on Williston Road. And I made it a point of getting all of their supply orders as if they ordered film, if they ordered chemistry, if they ordered paper, I made sure that I was the guy that filled that order. Got to know the director of photography, whose name coincidentally was Jym Wilson.
With an I.
He actually went by James. As an aside, once I was hired, he and I covered the same event, and so there were two photos on top of each other with the byline photos by James L. Wilson and Jym Wilson. And
okay.
Wish I had that clip.
Yeah.
But in any event, they had an opening for a lab tech, and I got hired 2 days a week, Sundays and Mondays. I think it was about 12 hours or something like that. There was no photographer after noon on Sunday, and so I occasionally would go out and make photos for them.
And then you went to Gannett, and then USA Today is all part of that. So why did you leave the Free Press and go down to Washington?
I was a local guy, and so I didn't want to spend my entire career working in Burlington, Vermont, although at times I wonder about that. Maybe I should have stayed here. Because there's a lot to be said for institutional memory, as you well know. But I also really love politics, love national politics, and my job with Gannett News Service was covering the Hill for all of Gannett's papers. When Burlington, for example, had a need for a photo of Pat Leahy or Jim Jeffords or eventually Bernie Sanders, I did photograph him a couple of times, they would contact GNS and I would get an assignment to go cover whatever hearing it was that they needed. Or if, say, Ben and Jerry were going to receive an award at the White House, I would go and photograph that for the Free Press. And then, also got to do some international stuff for GNS. We did a big project one year on world population trends and women's health issues, which is a real mouthful. But basically what it did was it put me on the road for about 6 or 8 weeks one summer. And then I moved over to USA Today after a while. I was sort of seeing the writing on the wall about how much longer I wanted to be covering the same type of meetings every day, every year on the Hill. I wasn't going to advance. We weren't ever going to take the place of AP or even UPI or eventually Getty in terms of our access. And so working for the Life section at USA Today had a lot of appeal. And I ended up specializing in entertainment coverage, particularly award shows and a lot of movie stuff and music for about 12 of those 18 years.
And now you're in Springfield, Missouri. How did that come about?
Well, I left USA Today in 2015. I took a buyout, thought for sure that I would get another job in journalism. But as many people my age and with my experience discovered, it was a whole lot less expensive for big publications to hire two people who were 20 years old and had just got out of college who would work for half of what I would. So anyway, after 2 years, I found myself working at a hardware store, and then the money in the house ran out. The woman I live with had lost her job as an education consultant, and so we knew we needed to beat feet, and she had family in Springfield, Missouri, so that's how we ended up there.
And so when you say you got into photography, I mean, it really sounds like it was in your high school years. I mean, what fired you up about it?
That's a really good question. You know, for one thing, I love photographing music, so I got to hang around with the musicians that I knew. I liked photographing people right from the start. I mean, I have a photo package that I put together for my high school classes. I think it was 25th reunion, and it's about 100 photographs that I've made my senior year, and they're just all my friends and athletes and events at the school and things like that. So that type of photography, that documentary photography, is what really got me going. When I was considerably younger, when I was in fifth grade, would have been 1968, Life magazine was a big deal.
Yeah.
And in 1968, you know, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Yeah, like within a month or two of each other.
Yeah. Prior to that, of course, you had the space race and the Beatles and Life magazine again. And these great photos were coming into my house every single week. And somehow it opened my eyes. That opened my eyes up to the world. And then I started thinking, I want to be able to do that. You know, when I was a kid, if we had a roll of film down at the drugstore, I would be the one that would jump on my bike and pedal down to pick it up at the age of like 9.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it was interesting. We were both at this launch for the Bernie book last night, and you made a reference to this. You were talking about just the change in the technology and how on election night, 1981, you know, you were shooting with film back then. And today, you know, you have a disc you put in a camera.
Right.
Talk about that change. Is it good? Is it bad? What's the advantage, disadvantage of this move forward in technology?
The advantage, of course, is that rather than having to look at the film counter and realize that I've got a 36 exposure roll in there and I've already made 20 photos, and when do I want to change out to another roll, I carry a disc that holds 10,000 photographs. So the night that Bernie was elected, I was at the victory party waiting for him to show up, and I had that one roll of film. Now, I could have easily changed, but I might have missed something.
Right.
And I covered an election party a couple of years ago in Springfield, and never changed anything. And there's also just things about the adaptability of the digital camera. You know, its sensitivity to light is completely different from film. Everything back then, you pretty much always had to use flash a lot, which got into the whole thing of like, how quick is the flash going to come back? You know, recycle. And now you just crank the ISO, and you're working in available dark. Is what we used to call it.
And you had to set the camera in the old days at, you know, a certain f-stop and all that kind of stuff.
You could make mistakes, but there was a lot less latitude. The latitude now with most digital cameras, or at least the ones that I use, is something like 7 stops. You can make a mistake by 7 stops and still easily pull it out in Photoshop.
Yeah.
Whereas with film, you go into the darkroom and you start doing as best as you can to make a reproducible photo. That's one of the things about those party photos from when Bernie was elected, was every exposure was amazingly spot on. And I don't know if I could do that anymore. I mean, we worked really hard at our crafts, guys like Ron McNeil and Rob Swanson and I and the rest of the photographers at the Free Press. We wanted to make sure that we would go into something like that and not lose a photo.
Right. And, you know, I remember back too, because you and I shared time at the Free Press, you know, going back into the dark room when you guys are developing, I can still smell that smell of all those chemicals, and those days are gone too.
Those days are gone, which is a good almost entirely a good thing. I mean, when I first started working at the Free Press, I smoked. And, you're working prints in the developer and you got a cigarette like this. It's like, okay, well, there's probably a year off my life. But in any event, now I can take a photo, and I can make a photo, put it on my phone, and email it to my editors at the Springfield Daily Citizen. There are other photographers who can be even more efficient than that. The wire photographers in particular, they're like wired directly from their cameras to their phones. Perfect example is Doug Mills from the the New York Times. His photos can appear within minutes of something happening.
Yeah, I remember we all smoked in the newsroom too. And I mean, when you think about that today in 2026, I mean, that's just unbelievable. There were days you'd come back to the newsroom and you couldn't see to the back of the newsroom.
That's probably a good thing.
Yeah, it is.
that you can no longer smoke in newsrooms.
Yeah. Did you have any, this is your life, so did you have any people that you looked up to when you were a kid growing up who were photographers? So
my uncle, my mother's brother, was a very serious amateur. He had been in the Air Force and bought a camera, a Nikon, or as he would always say, a Nikon camera, when he was in Okinawa. He came back and I would occasionally see some of his photos, and he showed me how his darkroom worked and things like that. And those were on real quick visits from Vermont to North Carolina, and that would have been just before high school. And then I wasn't really aware of specific photographers until actually towards the end of high school. I subscribed to what was called Mom and Pop Photography. It was Modern and Popular Photography, 2 magazines. I subscribed to both of them. And, they would come to the house every month and I would study those photographs and started to pick up, okay, this is a guy whose work I really like. This is a woman whose work is really important.
Yep.
And to this day, I still have them in the back of my mind. Then when I started working locally, there were guys like Stu Perry, who technically was not particularly adept, but man, what an eye for news, what a nose for news. And then, Ron McNeil, the great Romac, who was UPI's stringer, or actually, I think he was UPI's staff photographer, I can't remember, who was a good friend, a good mentor. And then the story that I really love to tell is when we were all getting started, Rob Swanson, Bill Barton, and I would have breakfast about 3 times a week at Henry's, and we would sit there and talk about what we'd photographed the night before, how we'd done it, how had we processed it, what camera equipment did we use, what did the photo look like, what were we doing that day, how were we going to do it, and it was amazing we ever got dates, because a woman would come to that breakfast with us and she'd go, "You guys are idiots." Yeah. You might have come along on a couple of those breakfasts. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I probably, as a scribe, was probably not allowed. I think the work that Rob did was just phenomenal. I remember his motto always was, get close or get, angles on people, and just had these shots that were
tremendous
incredible.
Photographer. Go ahead.
And you and he were both there at that same exact moment. I remember he describes it as, shoulder to shoulder when Bernie walked in with with
his fist in the air, the prize fighter, as Dan Shiason describes it in his book. And talking about technical things, had Rob and I made our photos at the exact same second, our flashes would have overlapped, and either we would have caused some sort of technical disaster, but Rob was just a nanosecond behind me, and so mine is perfectly exposed and his is perfectly exposed. And it wasn't until I started looking for photos for the book and found my original photo that I realized that it was a horizontal. I made a horizontal. His horizontal became very, very popular and very well known, but because of the Free Press's design needs, we cropped mine to a vertical. There were a lot of questions about how would that play differently today, and what do we wish we'd done different. And I think that today, the little feature story about the town moderator who was retiring, it was a town meeting day. So there was a town meeting day feature about a moderator who was retiring after 50 years or something like that. So you've got this big, big color photo of this guy. Fine, makes sense, especially if there's no real news. Had Paquette won, would have probably been a little mugshot.
Right.
But instead, we had to, redesign and make the photo of Bernie bigger.
We're going to look at a number of your shots here in a moment. Is the Bernie victory shot the best photo you ever took?
No.
What's the best photo you ever took?
That's like, Paul McCartney was the one once asked, what's your favorite song? And he said, that's like asking me to name my favorite child.
Well, it's easy for me. I have one kid.
Yeah,
so,
I was fortunate enough to do some international work, and I was in Africa, essentially in the jungle for the funeral of a young woman who died from AIDS. And there's a photo that I'm very fond of. Fond is the wrong word, but that I still find very moving. And on another trip, I was in India, and we went to a village of the Dalit. And the Dalit were at one point known as the Untouchables, but we were with the Dalit, and we'd gone to this to meet these folks, and the women and their children all took the reporter and I down to a river to tell us about their lives. And there was our driver, our interpreter, and me. Those were the only three men, and all of these women. And to this day, it's just one of the most moving things. And there were good photos from that day too. So,
well, let's talk about this most recent project you've been working on. I've talked to Dan Chasen. He's a local guy from Burlington who's written this 600-page, really just an outstanding series of interviews that he got. I think that's what really makes the book work, is that he got some real Bernie insiders, including his older brother, to talk. And you have supplied photos for this. How did you get connected with Dan?
Yeah, so through his research, Dan found the Victory Night photo, tracked me down. Probably, I don't know whether somebody gave me his name, excuse me, or whether he found me on social media or whatever, but he tracked me down, sent me an email saying, hey, I'm writing this book about Bernie. It's not just your typical political biography. I grew up in Burlington, and it's going to be sort of a memoir. Would you talk to me about your photo? I'd had that request before, both about that photo and other photos that I've made. And so we ended up talking in October of 2023 for about an hour. And it was a great conversation. And at the end, I said, hey, if you'll send me what you're going to write about me, I would really appreciate it, because I'd like to fact check it. So he did. And I pointed out a couple of things that I thought, needed a little bit of tweaking. And this was very early in the writing phase. And he got back to me and said, wow, that was really, really helpful. And I said, well, if you'd like to send me everything you've written. And at this point, I think he was at about 400 pages. I'll give it a read and see if I can help in any way. And he did. And as I'm reading, I'm going, oh, I was at that. I've got a photo from that. And so I sent him notes back, and the rest, as you can imagine, is pretty straightforward stuff. I read a 400-page draft, a 600-page draft, and then got to take a look at the final galleys, but it was a little bit too late to read it closely. So I've read it, let's say, 2.25 times, 2.5 times.
Well, and I saw another interview with him where at one point it was up to 900 pages and then got cut back.
Yeah, I know that his publisher said, this is an awful lot. I've been trying to read David McCullough's biography of Truman for a couple of years. Harry Truman is from Missouri, so I thought, this is a must read. It's enormous, and it's still like, but the thing about biographies is you can dip in and out. You can put them aside for a while. You don't have to, it's not like a novel where you're waiting to get to the end,
Right. Yeah. It's a great book.
It is. It's a really good read.
It's really good. And also, obviously, Robert Caro's books all about Lyndon Johnson, are all, I think Dan told me at one point that one of those books is the largest that a book can be, that a binding will actually still hold on to it. So, so let's get to some of your photos here. Where do you want to begin here?
Well, let's start right at the very beginning in terms of Bernie, and that is the Pewa photo that I was talking about. As you can see, there's this photo. I went down from my little projection booth perch and had an AV department camera and just photographed this guy who had just finished talking to the students. And
I mean, the funny thing about this photo is that the way he's holding his hand, the look on his face, I mean, he looks a little bit older. We don't, obviously.
Of course not.
But he, I mean, you would know that's Bernie the moment you saw him.
I have shown this particular photo, the one that's from behind, to many people, and they've immediately said, that's Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the other things that's fun about this photo, in particular to me, is the faces of the students and knowing a few of them. Again, I was a freshman, these were seniors, but the fellow with the big guy with the dark hair and the sideburns, his name is Jerry Knowlting, and Jerry went on to become one of the lead attorneys in the lawsuit against Exxon after the Exxon Valdez.
Wow.
You might recognize the woman with the glasses, sort of in the back, in the middle back. That's Franny Bastian.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
okay.
who went on to work for a couple of the radio stations in town. So, and then obscured is the teacher. You can sort of see his smile on the left-hand side. It's Doug Tudhope, who was he was, I think, Grand Isle County Senator in the 80s, and I know he ran for lieutenant governor as well.
Yep. And he was one of the owners up at Shore Acres restaurant.
But the main thing about this photo was, making a good sort of news photo, even though I had no training and didn't know that it was a news photo, but also it was the first time I ever heard Bernie speak. And I have told the story many times that he spoke, unlike the other candidates who were there to speak to the class. He was running for governor. He talked about income inequality and the lack of universal health care in the United States. And, 50 years later, what does Bernie talk about? Right. Income inequality and the lack of universal health care. The guy has a true north. And it's one of the things I admire most about him. So anyway, that was very, very early. My very first day at the Burlington Free Press was April, I want to say 22nd of 1977, the night 2 days before. It was a Sunday, so Saturday morning, actually, the Black Cat Restaurant and State Theater burned to the ground after an explosion. And I went with a guy who became my mentor, Tim Rivers, to just sort of do aftermath photos. And
where's that located?
So that is what is now the Farmhouse.
Okay.
The Farmhouse Restaurant, which is also known as McDonald's, the old McDonald's place. Yep. Because when that was torn down, it was replaced eventually by a McDonald's. But we walked up to the police line, and Tim shows the cop his press pass, and the guy looks at me and goes, "What about him?" And Tim said, "Oh, he's with me. He's with us. He's with us." And I was hooked. Because the cop went, "Oh yeah, come on in." And I'm like, I can go places nobody else can go. You just, so anyway, that was the first day.
And there were a lot of fires back in that period of time in Burlington.
That one was a more mysterious one. The cause was never completely resolved. The fires you're referring to were primarily arson. They were in some circles known as the urban renewal arson fires. Who knows exactly how those fires came to be, but and then some of them involved the Catholic Church, and so there was talk about it being an altar boy. In any event, that's how it all got started. Just a couple months later, there I am on Colchester Avenue with Rick Jesse. There was a two-person escape, prison escape from St. Albans, and that's Butch Duell in the lead, headed to, and this is actually, ironically, right across the street from where Dan grew up. This is like, down before you head down into Winooski. Wow. And I've just always liked that photo, in part because pre-autofocus. I don't think I had a motor drive on the camera. In fact, I'm sure I didn't. I rode with Rick Jesse in his Volkswagen, and he's having me put the motor drive on his camera, and I came up with the lead photo. And I think that it was a photo like this that sort of had people at the Free Press going, "Hey, who is this kid?" Because I was 19. I was very young. Wow. So anyway, 2 years
and no gear. They were just.
You mean in terms of like SWAT gear or anything? Yeah. Well, this was back when county sheriffs were cowboys, practically. Yep. And Butch Duell was as big a cowboy as any of them. You'd have to ask Mike Donahue for Butch Duell stories. Yep. Couple of summers later, there was a disturbance in Battery Park. Jym Welch called me at home and said, "Hey, something's going on. Can you go check it out?" And I ended up there for a long time that night, and
Jym Wilson, managing editor at the Free Press.
Thank you. Yeah, and a good friend and a good mentor for both you and I. But this did not end well for the locals. The mayor had gotten tired of complaints about the mayor, meaning Gordon Paquette, complaints about rowdiness and people drinking beer and whatever else in Battery Park, and he decided he was going to break it up one night. And they ended up sending in the state police and the Burlington Fire Department to break things up. People got arrested. It wasn't like some civil unrest that you see. It was just, it was a step beyond spring fling, probably because there were no students involved.
Right.
These were locals. It was definitely a town gown sort of thing.
Yep.
Again, just a couple of, like a year later or so, a huge fire out at Rock Point, the old one of the old churches out there, the Episcopal church.
Yeah, that's a hell of a shot.
And this one never ran because it is in color, obviously. A very similar black and white version of this ran. Again, this is I would assume it was a Saturday night. Deadline is like right there. I think I went out at about 7:30 at night, and deadline would have been right around the corner. So no time to process color film, no time to, and so we swapped out the front page that day. But the biggest fire I had ever seen until at that point.
Do you remember when it changed from black and white to color?
Well, the Free Press was doing color even before I started there, but it required a lot of planning.
Because I can't say I remember a lot of color.
You definitely did not. It didn't run every day. It wasn't until after I had started there that they started running color more and more often. But it was expensive. It was time consuming to get it right. It took the law. It was rare for the Free Press to get color truly correct.
Well, because you had like different plates that had to match up.
Everything had to be
everything had to be primary colors.
Yeah. And the Free Press had a great press crew. I became friends with a couple of those guys, and whenever I had a special project that was going to run, I would go down and just sort of say, "Hey, I really care about this one," and they would, "Oh, really? Okay," and they'd tweak things up a little bit, which was really great. There were a couple of union drives at the Free Press, and particularly during the first one, when I was not management, I got to know some of the press guys even better because they were the force behind the union drive, the initiation of the union drive, and then it moved into the newsroom with guys like Rob Ely and Alan Abbey. So, yeah, who's that guy?
Yeah.
Who is that kid?
There's a blast from the past.
Yeah, he's like 55 in this photo, I think. This is 1980. Gannett News Service, who I would later go to work for, called the Free Press and said, "Hey, one of our national reporters is going up to Kennebunkport, Maine to profile this guy who's going to run for president. His name's George Bush. Can you send a photographer?" And Elaine Isaacson was the head of the department at the time. She had no interest in going. So they sent me. And again, in 1980, I'm 22 years old, don't own a coat, don't own a suit coat. But they sent me up there, and it was actually very, very interesting in the beginning of so this is how you work into political coverage. So the second day I was there, I'd made arrangements with either him directly or one of his sons to meet them at the house, because George and Barbara would jog every day with the dog. So I would drive ahead, get out of the car, make some frames, get back in the car, drive a little bit ahed.
I was going to ask you how you got that shot. I mean, you were just standing there and he just... he
happened to go by.
Ahead,
yeah.
And then
I had like one of the biggest cars I'd ever driven. It was a rental Thunderbird, and when he was done running, he got into the car, and I was driving them back to the compound, and I'm sure he was sitting in the back going, "The headline is going to be potential presidential candidate killed in fiery crash over off of Route 1," because it was just too big a car for me, for sure.
That looks like an outfit you might wear to the office as opposed to out running.
Yeah. Well, he was a preppy.
Yeah.
He was a very preppy guy.
It's a very preppy outfit. Yeah.
There's a whole series of photos from that. But again, this was sort of like the chase photo. The escapee photo. I think I would have been using a motor drive for this one, but again, no autofocus. yet somehow I've got him completely off the ground. The dog's not off the ground. And it was a photo that got me noticed. It got me noticed by the folks at Gannett News Service. And, it's one of those things that in the back of any manager's mind, you're always sort of on the lookout for talent.
And auto drive, we should just tell people, you just hold it down, it just fires off
right.
shot after another.
Motor drive, yeah. But again, with film, your top, rate of film progress, frames per second, would have been like maybe 3.5 frames per second, as opposed to now when you can, if you want to, you can make settings that will allow you to work at least 120 frames per second.
Wow.
It's just insane. I mean, you're basically making a movie and then, and trying to decide then. But 3.5 frames per second when you've got a 36 exposure roll,
right.
10 seconds and you're out of film.
Right.
So again, you might put it on single frame and you're just not having to manually advance the film. And again, going back to politics, and again, I want to say this is 1980. This is Pat Leahy's first run for re-election. The fellow with the suit in the background, Mike Calhoun, his press secretary. I managed to talk him into getting me into the senator's hotel room, and I want to say this was in Montpelier. I said, I just need a couple of minutes. I just need to get a photo of them watching the TV. And you can see that he was running against I can't remember
Stuart.
Ledbetter's. Was it Stuart?
Yeah.
But is his son Stuart as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Stuart Ledbetter, who became a journalist for WPTZ, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Yep. But there are so many things about this photo I love, particularly the kids and Calhoun, the thumb up to the chest, just totally optimistic. The kids clapping and looking excited. Marcel and Patrick are a little, they're still not sure because it's only a 6-point race, and there's not even 3,000 votes count. And Anthony Doria was running too. Now I forgot about Anthony Doria.
And that was a pretty tight race, as it turned out. Yeah.
Well, again, it was his first time running for re-election.
Yeah.
But I made sure to send the senator a copy of that photo, and he never forgot me.
Yeah, well,
there are things that you do to just remind people who you are and that you were there for an important moment in their life.
Maybe you started him on the trend of. I think every person I know in Vermont has got a picture that Pat Leahy has sent them. He really prides himself on being quite a photographer too. Yeah, I won't ask you to rate his skill level.
That's what he's doing.
Yeah.
And and just to see Marcel is a real nice thing for me. She was a lovely, lovely woman, or is a lovely, lovely woman, and as he will quickly say, probably the reason he got elected a couple of times because of her fluency in French.
Yeah, she was able to go up, up into the kingdom and up into Franklin County and converse with voters in a way that he literally could not.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. My lovely wife, Marcel. And then
there it is.
Then there's this photo. Yep, March 1981, town meeting day, completely unexpected. Bernie pops through the door, hands up in the air for a split second, and then began talking for about the next 40-something years. But for 8 years in Burlington as mayor, an exciting time to live here, an exciting mayor to cover. So many changes under his administration, particularly when it came to young people, when it came to the arts, when it came to getting the streets shoveled.
Yep.
What a concept. Get the streets cleared after a snowstorm and you might get reelected.
Started the Community Economic Development Office. Yep.
And sort of fought off developers who wanted to take over the waterfront. And Dan Chasen in his book, I think, does a good job pointing this out, that, Bernie supported initially what was known as the Alden Project, which needed to get a bond vote support. This is about when I came in at the Free Press, and it needed a 2/3 vote, and it got a little over 50%. But he, and Dan chronicles this, I think, quite well. Bernie then pivoted and then got behind the support of the newer plan that has resulted in what is a lot more park space today than what was under that original plan. Yeah. When I came into town this past Saturday, and a friend drove me from the airport, and we took a little tour down through that part of the city. And it's just stunning to me in the last 9 years, these $400,000 to $1 million apartments, or you can rent one for $4,000 a month. That definitely are not what people were thinking about 40 years ago. But yeah, this was quite a night. I mean, Chris Bajalian asked me last night, what was the newsroom's reaction to this photo, and I pretty much fumbled the answer. Because it is a good question. What was the newsroom thinking? And we were running on adrenaline, which you do on town meeting days anyway, because at the time the Free Press covered the entire state. We did a lot of what's called editioning, which was unusual for the Free Press, where you were truly changing three or four times during the course of the night. The first edition that's going to the farthest reaches of circulation, and the final edition being the one that people in Burlington are going to get. So yeah, we're shocked, but boy, let's get a good photo on the page. Yep. Alan Abbey, you better write some analysis, and what are we going to do tomorrow? Because this is a big story.
Well, and I've gone back and looked at this, and Alan Abbey, who was the City Hall reporter at the time, really telegraphed a couple of days before the election that this was a real possibility. I mean, the Gordy Paquette, who was the 24-year incumbent, had really not campaigned an awful lot. There really seemed to be this whole groundswell that was kind of building. But, one of the really interesting parts about the talk last night and about Dan's book is, just on election night, things got really crazy. And, John Franco got the ballots impounded and brought over to the Chittenden County Superior Court. There's a lot of concern. We've heard a lot of talk these days about election integrity. And there were some real questions that night about whether or not ballots might disappear or whatever.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. There is, I did say something to Dan, and he quoted me verbatim, and so I can't fault him for that in the book. But I did sort of misspeak. I said something along the lines of the Bernie had a lot of support in the newsroom. That was not at all to mean that people were going out, reporters were not going out and campaigning for Bernie, but they were like, this is a really good story. This is a city that's ready to change. Yeah. Wouldn't it be amazing if this guy won? That's the type of support I was talking about. I wasn't saying that people were going, oh, let's write a bad story about Paquette. Let's all wear our Bernie buttons or whatever. That did not happen in that newsroom.
Right. No, I mean, he's just a heck of a lot more interesting person to cover than some of the old-time Democrats.
Yeah. As sort of an aside, I was living in D.C. when Bernie was getting ready to run for president the first time, and I happened to be in a sort of journalist, bar, dive, restaurant around the corner from the Washington Post one afternoon. And there was a political reporter from the Post who I did not recognize, but he was in there with his editor, and I heard the editor say, well, what about this guy, Bernie Sanders? And he was immediately dismissive. Oh, never going to happen. He's just never even going to get out of the blocks. And I wanted to go over to them and say, you've never been in a room with Bernie with like an 80-year-old woman who's on, some sort of assistance and who's wondering if she's going to have heat or is she going to have her prescription meds. You be in a room with him when he's going to close like that, you're going to think a lot differently about this guy. It was one of the things about that campaign that to this day bothered me, is that the national media took a long time to get hip to Bernie. They were far more interested in the clicks that they could generate covering a certain Republican from New York, as opposed to an independent socialist from New York.
Yeah, and Dan talks about this in his book. The backroom deals that have gone on, and when he ran against Hillary Clinton in 2016, there was a real. That's what started the book for Dan Chasen. Is he goes to this meeting of sort of the intelligentsia. He teaches down at Wellesley, and they're all talking about how to basically stop Bernie.
Yeah, I have no inside knowledge to that, to any of that. I was even out of journalism at that point. But there were things, as I was reading the Washington Post and watching things on television, that made me go, that this is a rigged game. This is a rigged game.
Yeah.
So anyway, and this photograph is what sort of began it.
Do you know who the woman is on the right?
I don't, and I'm sure somebody, somebody in the room tonight, when the old Free folks get together, would remember who that is. So this is 1984. Island Pond, the church at Island Pond, which has a different name now, but it's still there, I believe. Some people thought it was a cult. Some people thought it was a commune. It was a religious commune. Sect, commune, to be fair.
And let me fill people in a little bit. I mean, John Donnelly, who worked at the Burlington Free Press, who was a reporter, his job is actually the one that I took. He had written this 5-part series about the cult and the kingdom, where this is the state raid on Island Pond that we're looking at a picture of. There was no way, when Dick Snelling was the governor, there was no way that the state could have not gone in. I mean, the claims of child abuse, they were, hitting their kids with a rod. It was sort of this philosophy of, don't spare the rod or spoil the child. And it was deemed to be child abuse. Now, Judge Frank Mahady released all the kids on the theory, basically, that if you have specific cases of child abuse, let's have those kids come in. And you can't just, if you hear of child abuse in, say, Montpelier, you can't round up every kid in Montpelier. But it was a heck of a day. This was about 2 weeks after I started.
I worked with John on that series, doing the photos for most of it. John worked on his own a lot and spent a huge amount of time there trying to get in with the folks. But it was quite a day. And I can't remember who it was that sent Frank Mahady there, but knowing that Frank Mahady was probably the best judge on constitutional issues in the state, it was smart for them to send him. Like 2 weeks later, the Amtrak disaster. I had just given my home phone number to a fellow by the name of Wayne Savage, who was a scanner buff, and said, "Hey, if you ever hear anything worthwhile, give me a shout."
Still is.
10 after 7, Saturday morning, I guess it was. My phone rings. He says, "There's a train derailment in Essex Junction. It sounds bad." And I fly out the door, and when I got there, the thing I remember most was how quiet it was. And hearing birds singing. But I think that there were 5 people who died, and the reason that the cause of the crash was that a beaver dam had given way upstream, causing this huge wall of water to come down and wash away the track, or
underneath it, the bedding,
the bed underneath. So. Another photo from the same thing. A friend of mine calls this my Iwo Jima photograph. And it's funny because another friend looked at it and said, "Hey, that's my father-in-law." I mean, that's one of the things about working here in Vermont. Molly Walsh and I went to the Soviet Union for about 3 weeks with kids from Circus Smirkus. The fellow with the red hair right in the center is Toby Ayers, who folks here at CTV, they may remember his dad. This fellow here with the long hair across his face is Jade Kinder Martin, who later became one of the great aerialists in the world. All I can say is just Google him and be amazed. The reason for the trip was the kids from Circus Smirkus met up with kids from the Soviet circus. And at the time, the Moscow circus was a huge deal. And they trained together for about a week in Moscow while Molly Walsh and I went off to Yaroslavl. And then they put on a show in Yaroslavl and then went on to another set of shows. But Molly and I went to Yaroslavl to do a package of stories on the Sister City program. And we were trying to do that sort of like, here are the things that are the same, here are the things that are different. And I was obsessed with finding a farmer, and we were driving back from some farm where we had not been allowed to go into the barn. And I see these 2 guys out in a field and with cows behind them. I just stop the car. And I ran up to this guy with my cameras, and I had learned about a dozen phrases in Russian, and I, pointed at myself and told him my name and said, American periodista, American journalist. And he went, "Russian cowboy." And it's still one of my favorite memories.
It's a great shot.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a favorite. And I had to show this photo.
Oh boy.
John Galemore, who just passed last year. What can you really say except for he was the singing voice of Vermont, and a lovely, lovely human being.
Inspired so many kids to
and
become musicians.
I listen to his music several times a year just because I need to hear that voice. And I pulled into his house and into the drive, and he said, "What do you want me to do?" And I said, "Well, go grab your guitar and stand over there." And And I said, why don't you sing? And I didn't even have to say, why don't you sing? He just started strumming, threw back his head, and he had just this beautiful voice. Just one of my favorite memories. I continue to photograph musicians. Now, this is some more recent work, and this is in Springfield, Missouri. This is an artist named Molly Healy, and we were doing a big profile on Molly for the Springfield Daily Citizen, which is a online-only, nonprofit, community-centric news outlet, which is a real mouthful, but it's a way of saying that I'm doing community photography, community journalism again, and that I very firmly believe that community journalism is the future of journalism. Molly is an activist. She's a musician. She's a lovely person, and this was for a little profile on her. I also am covering courts again for the first time in a long, long time. We had just got cameras in the courtroom a few years before I left, but this was a quadruple murder sentencing. This fellow was found guilty for a crime that he'd committed in 2014. And as he was being sentenced, he turned to me, looking right at me, because there were other reporters in the room, but he, of course, would know the guy with the cameras, and I'd also covered his trial. And he said, I need the media to help me get free. I am not guilty of this. It was a very odd moment. And then sometimes you just go out and chase the news. Big storms are, a couple of times a year in Springfield, Missouri. And I got a call in the dentist chair. And so went out and started looking around town. And I saw the guy come around the corner of his house with his cane and just stop and look. And I'm making photos from across the street. And I went over and I said, everybody okay? And he said, it's cosmetic. And, you look at his roof and it's, there's a good chunk of it going, it's cosmetic and we're all fine. So that's, that's sort of where I'm at right now. You go from covering fires in Burlington, Vermont and mayoral elections in Burlington, Vermont to a guy who's going to run for president, not just the mayor, but George Bush, and then ending up in DC for a while and then back in a city with a Gannett paper that is not doing so well, and so online journalism is stepping in to fill the void. I
mean, the whole industry. I mean, the Burlington Free Press today has 10% of the staff that it had when you and I were there. I mean, you obviously must be concerned about the future of newspapers and journalism in general.
I certainly am. In spite of the hypocrisy of the owner by using this motto. The Washington Post motto is democracy dies in darkness. And the fact that they laid off a huge part of their staff today goes to show you how hypocritical that is, because Jeff Bezos certainly can't afford to keep a couple hundred people employed because yacht fuel is expensive. But more importantly, democracy dies in darkness, and people need to be informed, and they need to know what's going on in their communities. They need to know if their mayor is doing a great job or if their mayor is doing a bad job. They need to know if their school board is promoting good education programs, or if they're siphoning money into their pockets through the school bus fuel fund. Yep. And then there's, just like the arts getting the coverage that it deserves. And that's why community journalism is so important right now. National journalism is in a weird place. And too many people getting all of their news from social media where you have no idea if it's even authentic. Yep.
Speaking of which, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up here, are you worried about AI? Artificial intelligence? I mean, now you can create a photo that isn't really real.
Yeah, well, of course. And I just was at a seminar in November where one of the speakers was talking about AI, a fellow from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who had done a one-year study that was sponsored, I want to say, by Stanford. Study of AI and journalism. And there are steps that are being taken by the camera manufacturers and the software producers to label these things as AI, to not be able to remove those watermarks. But somebody's going to always find a workaround. And so that's one of the reasons why trained journalists are important. It's great that, like, for example, in Minnesota, you've got all these citizen journalists or just observers running around with their cell phones. Yep. But you need people who know how to be objective as you can be in a situation like that, to be fair, and who are, trained professionals is not quite the right phrase, but at the same time, hey, kids don't do this at home applies as well. You need people who have editors that are going to ask them hard questions when they get back to the newsroom. And as far as AI producing photos, it is very scary that you can feed one photo in and tell it to make it into something else. And the president loves that particular aspect of AI.
Would you advise kids to get into photography, newspaper photography today?
What I always tell any journalism student, whether they want to get into photography or the word side or illustration or whatever, is, yeah, sure, get your journalism education, but take some foreign languages, take either French or Chinese, because the places where I've had the hardest time talking were places where they were speaking French or Chinese. And I could have learned French, but I know Spanish. And to also, find the thing that makes you passionate. What are the stories you want to tell? Do you want to talk about do you want to write about the environment, or do you want to make photographs about, for environmental stories? So yeah, journalism education is important, but I, for example, don't have one. My education came from the newsroom. And if you've got good mentors, and if you've got editors who are paying attention to the work that you're doing, that's as good an education. All my education friends, particularly those who are journalism educators, I love the work you're doing, and I admire it. And whenever I speak to a class of students, I say, the very first thing I say is, thank you for your interest, and we need you now more than ever. So
let's end there.
That's a good one.
Great to see you.
Good to see you, Mark.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for joining us on our profile here of Jym Wilson, J.Y. Wilson. And we hope to bring back more memories and more great journalists like him. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.